One of the editions that I've made that's given me the most particular pleasure is that of the 2 episodes from Lenau's Faust. Now, everybody knows the second one. If you know the piano duet version or the orchestral version, you might even know the first one. But the 2 of them as piano solos have never been printed together until this edition. And there's a problem which is easily resolved to explain why this came to pass. Liszt made the first Mephisto Waltz probably as early as 1857 as a piano piece, and was still working on it right up to publication a couple of years later. And then he wrote another work to precede it called The Procession by Night, Der Nächtliche Zug. And he expected both of these pieces to be played by an orchestra by then. And he himself, as far as I can work out, never played the first Mephisto Waltz on the piano. But the 2 orchestral pieces belong together, and they are both preceded by long excerpts from Nikolaus Lenau's poem, Faust. And they make such an excellent pairing, and it seemed such a strange thing that Liszt never made a solo piano version of the first one, that one of his students, a man called Robert Freund, who was really a great proselytizer for Liszt's music, and for those who collect rare piano records, he was also the brother of Etelka Freund, who made marvelous recordings. He came to Liszt with a manuscript which he said, "Maestro, I have used your your piano duet version and your orchestral version of this piece to do what I think you should have done in the first place, and I've produced a version for piano." Liszt said, "That's marvelous, I'll have it published." Then, absolutely typical with Liszt, he took Freund's manuscript home and rewrote it from top to bottom. And but nonetheless, when it was published, it came out with Liszt's gracious allowance that it had been arranged by Robert Freund. And this has led a whole lot of Liszt scholars to dismiss it immediately as something that was merely a transcription of Liszt by somebody else. But 5 seconds with the manuscript will assure you that Liszt's input is mighty and considerable. And since, in any case, it had been arranged in the first place from something that Liszt had already done as a piano piece, even if for 4 hands, I think we have to go along with it. And it's an absolutely marvelous piece. It's one of those things that by Liszt where he's daring to write harmonies that no one else would do, and progressions that no one else would dream of writing. And it's so different in temperament from the first Mephisto Waltz that it really is an ideal piece to play before it. And it's a great study on the piano in finding different orchestral sounding piano textures. You will have noticed probably, if you've played any Liszt at all, that Liszt brings to mind in his piano music very often orchestral textures and even particular instruments, and sometimes he actually writes something like quasi trombo or quasi violoncello to indicate that this is the sound he's looking for you to imitate. This is in complete contradistinction to the music of Chopin, which always sounds completely as if it was conceived for the piano, and with best respects to people who've orchestrated it, really belongs right there on the piano. Liszt's sound world, I think, is really quite different. So you can always imagine at the beginning of this piece that we're dealing with cellos and basses, for example, and then horns. This is even if you had never seen the score. And so on. Among the most attractive things that Liszt manages in this piece, this extraordinary series of harmonies. This is such a lovely thing. Everybody should have a go at this to put with the first Mephisto Waltz so that you can introduce people to a wider range of what Liszt's able to do. And similarly, in this piece, Liszt introduces a plain song for his choir to sing after you've heard them processing through the woods. It's Pange Lingua Gloriosi, which he also used in one of the symphonic poems. And that allows him a very nice contrast and almost a friendly atmosphere and lovely sounds like and this builds to a mighty climax, and then it disappears in something which is harmonically completely magical. And that's just pushing the piano to its absolute limits, but also giving you one of the great harmonic shocks. And so I recommend everybody has a look at this piece. Then the other piece is, of course, the first Mephisto Waltz, which everybody knows and which everybody plays, but very few people then have a proper look at the score to see what Liszt actually wrote in it. He marks it Allegro vivace. He's got quasi presto in brackets after that, but that, for my money, means not too fast. His pedal directions are very long, and I think we have to flutter our pedal a bit on a modern piano in order not to overwhelm people with the build-up of sound. But it's sort of become the way of people playing this at the beginning, completely secco, and that's not really what Liszt asks for. He actually writes a pedal that goes for about 12 bars. And it's worth working out a way whereby you can do exactly what he asks for. But not too fast, because the people who are going to hear this tune for the first time it has to be clear and clean. Then we have some accents that are present in almost none of the performances that one ever hears, which are these. But they come every single time Liszt uses that phrase, so they're worth putting in. The long glissando, a couple of editions suggest that you should take 3 bars to play it, but I think if you look very carefully at how Liszt has barred the piece, it's pretty clear that he wants a 3-bar rest, and then the glissando has to be done in the space of 1 bar. So long as we are not playing too fast, it should work. That tempo will give you 1, 2, 3, and that is, I think, what we should try and do. The middle section of this piece is very carefully marked by Liszt un poco meno mosso, and then in brackets ma poco. In other words, only slightly slower than the first section. And of course, the tradition, which doesn't come from Liszt, is to play it much slower. One often hears by which stage all recollection of the waltz has disappeared. So is probably closer to the tempo he was looking for. The passages which are marked ossia, every time that happens, they are printed on an extra staff. Some editions swap that round with the main text. It is customary to play the harder text, and this applies to pretty well all of Liszt. If he writes an ossia and it's more difficult, you can be sure that this is what he played either in private or in public himself. The middle section of this piece also exists in another manuscript, which may have been intended to be added to this work, or it may have been intended to be a way of providing a separate album leaf. There's no absolute firm way of deciding which. My edition prints all of the available extra material, which starts just before the middle section. So instead of going and then at the end of that section, instead of playing which we would then be expecting, and by the way, this should be played in tempo so that his 4 bars rest makes some sense, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. But in this version where there's all these extra bars, it's and it's essentially what's going to follow in the version we all know and love, but in a rather a simplified way. And it actually comes to an end in D flat, which, if we're right in thinking this belongs in this piece, that follows on there. At the end of this, I've added some counting numbers just because Liszt put them in at the beginning in the orchestral version, but very often one hears the end of this presto played with the emphasis on the wrong syllable, as it were. But if you play 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, because this writes a 2-bar phrase of rests there, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1. And similarly, the next time, where you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And of course, Liszt only writes poco rit there, but he is very often given a ritenuto which stops anyone from comprehending the meter. It's so slow. There's one famous wrong note in many editions, or there are two actually. The first one is there's, for some unknown reason, even the new Liszt edition, I think, prints E flats there. It can't possibly be right. It's E natural in all the sources, and E natural is exactly what it should be in that harmony. So which is perfectly natural progression. The chord which is frequently played erroneously and published erroneously is this one, where one very often sees with a D sharp, and the D sharp can't have any possible relevance to the harmony or to the progression because it's so it's our old friend the German augmented sixth, and that's all there is to it. So the next textual problem is the manuscript's very messy about this, but it's got to do with the octave signs at the end of this passage, where many editions put an octave sign for 8 bars, where it's quite clear from at least one point in this manuscript where it says loco that the second bar of the pair is an octave lower. That's to say bar 798, which is this one just before. So what it really should be is every time like that, one up, one down. And so on. Otherwise, fairly straightforward. The coda, where he just says ritenuto il tempo. Remember, your tempo is presto when you get to ritenuto il tempo, so it cannot be adagio. And what should give you the clue is this rhythm, which is the only back reference to a waltz. And so if you take the tempo of and have instead At this point, if you know the orchestral version, you will know that there is a harp cadenza. In recent years, a manuscript turned up at Sotheby's in London of a wee cadenza which goes which is almost certainly intended for this piece, and so it is printed in this edition. So it's not compulsory, but if you do it, then it makes a very similar feeling to the orchestral one. So you end up with that, then one on the empty beat, one. Now there's another problem on the last page of this piece because Liszt didn't actually make it completely specific, but if you compare it with the other versions, it's got to be that when the 2/4 bars come, a 2/4 bar is equal to a 3/8 bar that preceded it. So we have and that gives you 2 6-bar phrases, and or 3 4-bar phrases. You can count it whichever way you like, but it's the only way to make it add up correctly, and it's obviously intended to add up correctly because the whole piece is more or less in 4-bar phrases. Here, as elsewhere, when Liszt goes to the trouble of printing a great long poem or section of a play or whatever else at the beginning of the work, it's a very good thing to give it a read before you play the music. And so some editions of this piece, of course, just leave it out, and then people don't know even that the proper title of the work is A Dance in the Village Inn, and the subtitle is Mephisto Waltz. So it's also worth getting hold of Lenau's poem and reading it complete. It's very long. Unfortunately, there's no edition of it currently available in English. You can read it online in German, that's for sure. The 2 sections that Liszt used to write these pieces are translated excellently by Michael Short in my edition. So you can have it, so long as you've got either English or German at your disposal, you can read them, and it's very helpful. Also very helpful in the first piece because Liszt arranged the whole poem to be printed at the beginning of the work, but also during the course of the work prints various verses at appropriate places. And so that's always a clue for interpretation. That, I hope, gives you enough enthusiasm to have a look at the pair of pieces as they belong together. Thank you.